Welcome, everybody, to our Personalization TLC Advanced topic. Our guests today for the panel are Tony Ferreira, Paul Legutko, Michael Feiner, and Vanessa Greenlee. Welcome, you guys. For those of you who don't know Tony, he's at Republic Wireless. He has more than 10 years of experience in digital strategy and optimization, with 5 years focused in customer experience and personalization. In his past, he has consulted in digital strategy, optimization, personalization for more than 50 Fortune 500 companies. So he knows his way around personalization. So welcome, Tony. And Tony, just a reminder, your webcam is still paused. Paul Legutko is a good friend of mine from my time with the symphonic arm of Ernst & Young, EY. And he's definitely an expert. He's one of the smartest people that I had the chance to work with at EY. He's got more than 14 years as a digital analytics consultant, and he specializes in the deepest of deep dive analytics, segmentation analysis, targeting, attribution, and data integration. His experience crosses pretty much so every industry with a lot of focus in media, entertainment, retail, and financial services. So welcome, Paul. Michael, who those of you who were here last week and anybody who's ever been to the DA Hub has met, Michael Feiner is of Leap 3, and he is an industry leader in digital analytics and optimization. If you haven't yet been to the DA Hub, I am not just saying this, it is one of the best conferences for digital analytics and optimization available, and I highly encourage you to go. It was the inspiration for the test and learn community. And then we have Vanessa. Welcome, Vanessa. Vanessa Greenlee of Dignity Health has more than 10 years of experience in analytics and market research. And a lot of her focus has been on healthcare personalization, which I'm sure many of you know there's a lot of ethical considerations in there. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today. But she also has experience with optimization and A/B testing. So welcome, panel. Really glad to have you there. And let's get started with the foundation of our conversation. It feels like before we start talking about the details of personalization, we need to talk about how we're defining it. And I've had separate conversations with each of my panelists at different times about this. So I think the conversation is going to be interesting. And I'm actually going to go out of order a little bit. And I'm going to start with you, Paul. If you wouldn't mind describing for those of us and for the panel to kick us off, how do you define personalization, and where does it start, and other things that people often call personalization end? You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, excellent. Well, okay, so for me, personalization is all about customer experience, user experience, and it is necessarily 360 in the sense that the customer's experience with the brand involves, digital, mobile, in-store, on the phone, etc. But it's about tailoring a customer experience based on what you know about the customer, so that he or she, honestly just feels special, right? So that it's a unique experience for them. They feel like someone is paying attention to their own desires, their own needs, their own specific use case for coming to talk to you or coming to your website. For me, it's about user experience, and it's about that kind of, for lack of a better word, that feeling special, feeling unique, feeling that you're not just one in a crowd. I can go into a little bit more about what I think it entails too, because there are personalization has kind of evolved, I think, in the last I don't know, since I first heard the term, maybe 10 years ago. It used to just be about things like user preferences, things like saved greetings, things about like how how large my screen should be, and how I like to be contacted, for example. Now I think it's more about an expectation that a customer will pick up where they left off last time with the brand, uh, and that the experience will take into consideration all of my prior interactions with the brand. And that makes personalization very complicated in today's environment because, as I already mentioned, you have to be 360. Because you're 360, you now have a very large burden on your analytics infrastructure. So you have to have, something like a customer data lake that will combine all of this 360 together. You've in that data lake, you have to have analytics engines that are accomplishing segmentation, that are accomplishing lookalike modeling, that are using predictive analytics to try to figure out exactly what a customer is going to do next. And then you have to have a mechanism to apply all of this. So, your data lake and your statistics are churning out scores and coefficients. Some rules-based engine has to translate those into a way of applying that through either a product recommendation database or through a digital asset management repository, and then putting that into that experience, whether that experience is whether it's online, whether it's in an ad, or whether it's on mobile app, or even like at a call center, where someone is looking at a customer dashboard. Finally, you have to have a mechanism for measuring and optimizing it. And this is where the testing comes in. This is where the learning comes in. It's really a holistic program, but it's also one which I think, unlike 10 years ago, people understand now the complexity of it and understand that this is not it's not a quick fix. It's not something you can just buy off the shelf.
I think it's interesting you say that you think people understand and recognize that, because I'm not sure that's true. I hear a lot of, I want personalization, and what they mean is I want targeting, basic targeting, retargeting, geo-targeting. So I'm curious, Tony or Vanessa, have either one of you experienced that, a lack of understanding in your organization of what personalization really is, or could be, should be?
I think the toughest thing for us is the defining what personalization is, not only from a standpoint of our organization, but to the people who have to implement personalization. And that's been sort of our biggest roadblock to date is, yes, we want to do personalization, but what does it mean for us? Because it's very different depending upon your industry and what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, as well as who your customers are. And then sort of putting that into the language of the engineering or development team so that they can get it to the forefront so that it gets to the viewpoint of the consumer themselves.
So do you include in Republic Wireless, do you guys think of personalization as inclusive of things like recommendation engines and targeting and segmentation, or is it all of those things, or some of those things separate and part of a different program?
I think it's pieces of them put in to a personalization program. Information is really the key foundation to personalization, because without the information, you can't really personalize the experience. So we're thinking of leveraging a combination of those things in different ways to provide personalization. But it's more about trying to be seamless and unidentified from the consumer. So basically, our personalization process moving forward is trying to be around creating an experience that the customer wants without them knowing that that experience is changing in any way, shape, or form. It just is the experience.
Okay, so that brings me very interestingly. You're the first person in your industry that I've heard say that. Now, obviously, we hear things like that all the time, Vanessa, from healthcare, from insurance. I mean, obviously, you got to be very, very careful in those industries. Vanessa, do you want to talk to that a little bit about how personalization, how you have to be careful in healthcare, and what types of things you've had to do, and how that affects your ability to have a personalization program?
Sure, absolutely. I would say we're in a very similar spot to what Tony was talking about. It's still a newer concept for our organization, and there's certainly opportunities to educate our internal business partners. But yeah, certainly there's an area of sensitivity. We're dealing with people's healthcare information, and that carries big responsibility with it. And I think that's those criteria and how kind of those sensitivity thresholds are something that we're going to be establishing as we build our personalization programs. But I mean, certainly diagnosis information is a huge area that we cannot personalize on, even though, that information is being tracked. And so there's that aspect of it. And there's also consumers' journeys as a patient with us in visiting in our specific example, our hospitals. And so depending on the nature of the services they're receiving, the personalization sensitivities will likely differ. So for example, someone who's an orthopedics patient who's going in for an elective surgery, we may be able to personalize a little bit more versus someone going through an oncology experience and say they're further down their diagnosis. There's certainly going to be sensitivities where we need to be very mindful and respectful, I should say, of those sensitivities. So yeah, there's definitely a lot there. We're entering into that area. We still have a lot of work to do, but it's definitely on our radar.
Awesome. Michael, are you there? I can't find you on my screen. There you are. Hey, what experiences have you had, and how do you see it's different? And in particular, one of the areas that I really was excited to still have you on the panel, and glad that you didn't have to drop out, from the EU versus US perspective, especially with GDPR. How does personalization?
Yes. So I would say GDPR has not really hit yet. It's at least not personalization, but also remember, and I feel like we've kind of covered that very similar situation we discussed in the last panel, is that we are unfortunately slightly behind the curve in Europe in terms of what we're doing generally. So yes, we are stronger maybe on the privacy side, but certainly on the technology scale, we're not a European Union one market. We are 27 countries, as opposed to the equivalent. The US is the equivalent size of a market, slightly smaller, but it's one country, and it's one language, and it's one company, and much more similar experiences. So for us, theoretically, personalization should be more important because there are different cultural aspects that we should take into account. That being said, every entity on its own is smaller, and therefore we cannot get to what I was very impressed with, what Paul has described it to me. That's like, think about it as a deep personalization. I can't say that I know of any company in Europe that's doing what Paul has described. I suspect there are very few but good companies in the US that are at that level, but far more than you would in Europe. So I think that the GDPR, that discussion is started now in full swing, taking into account that we need to be compliant by May. But I think that to a certain degree, where we are at personalization is slightly further behind, and therefore the GDPR aspect has not come so strong in the context of personalization. Basically, we're still struggling to get personalization up and running. We're not even thinking of the context of GDPR in that sense. What I would say is that we certainly, and I'll stop there and say that we're probably much more into the targeting than we are into the pure personalization, though we do have some use cases of personalization.
And let's talk about that for a second. Let's before we dive into actual use cases, let's talk about the the ethical considerations or the legal considerations coming soon with GDPR. of personalization. Most of you probably, if not all of you, are aware of the example that Target stores, and it's been a while now, but the gist was they were tracking web behavior and searches, and then they were targeting the email, not the emails, the physical mail that they would send to your house based on, what you purchased in the store using their card and then what you did online. I mean, it's not anything surprising. It happens to all of us probably if you use a loyalty card at the grocery store. The problem becomes when Target starts sending ads to your house about, baby diapers, and there's nobody in the house that's pregnant, except maybe there is, and it's your teenage daughter. And so it was a big blow up, and then it's also served as a really nice foundation for us to start thinking ethically. And I have worked with several health industry companies, Vanessa, that actually do utilize their diagnosis codes in their personalization. And it's really interesting to me because I know you said that there are different degrees of sensitivity around personalization depending on the diagnosis. And I absolutely see that. I've even seen one particular insurance company that actually you have your score for your personalization, and you have a second score for sensitivity based on the diagnosis code. And some of them are do not contact for obvious reasons. I mean, that's super personal information. But anyway, I'm very curious from you guys, from your perspective, panel, what experiences do you have? What type of considerations do you have to make in your personalizations program? Tony, I would love to hear you unpack a little bit why you try to be invisible in a wireless company. Why do you feel the need?
Just in my past experience as a consultant, just being across different industries, one of the things that was happening when personalization first came out was sort of this over personalization, where people were trying to personalize literally everything and anything. And it was to this point where it was just sort of overwhelming to a consumer, to the point now where customers themselves have said, we want a customized experience, but we don't want it to get in the way of the task that we have at hand. When it comes to wireless, we're a small company competing with Verizon's and AT&T's of the world, and if we can be a little bit more seamless in the way that the experience is interacted with from a consumer, then it's a more enjoyable process. And it's a big task to switch from one carrier to another. I'm not sure if any of you have experienced it or not, but it's a daunting task to complete. So the easier it can be, the more seamless it can be, and the more personalized and intuitive it is and helpful, the easier we're going to make it for you as the consumer to sort of complete your task and become a member of ours.
So it's less about ethical considerations and more about, if we make it seamless and invisible, then it's just easier for you. And if the easiest way, based on what we can tell from your data, if the easiest way for you to switch to Republic Wireless happens to be chatting, we're going to surface up chat for you, where I might not do that for another customer based on what I know about them or lookalike models that I have, or that sort of thing.
Yeah, there are some ethical things that come in once you become a member, and we try to do
sure.
Because we have two journeys to personalize. We have a prospect personalization journey and a member personalization journey. And the member piece is the more scary from a data perspective, because there's so many things they provide to us that we could surface up and use, and we try to limit that as best we can, where prospect side, it's sort of more behavioral than it is information.
Sure, that makes sense. What about you, Michael? What do you guys have to do for ethical considerations?
Most of my experience, I would actually intend the ethical, I think, would be more interesting to hear from Vanessa, given the sensitivity of the data. My experiences was more on the sports and a very similar situation to Tony in a wireless. So I think that again, our main challenges were predominantly technological. And
Mhm.
how do we get things moving fast enough to provide a relevant experience? In terms of the ethical side of it, there is, at least I've been fortunate enough that the clients I've worked with have had a very positive view about this. So it's, yes, we are not, even if we can, we're not going to exploit what we can do. But of course, once that door opens, and when you have people that have targets on their heads, that temptation will always be there. So the question is whether you build the system in a way that cannot take advantage of something that would appear as wrong. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that there's this notion that you think that because we're more sensitive to privacy, we necessarily have more focus on it. As I said to my answer before, actually we're struggling with a much more fundamental challenge than the ethical side. But yeah, we do have those discussions. So guess, yeah.
Well, and you're right. I mean, obviously in the healthcare industry, they're going to be a lot more sensitive to it. But um, Vanessa, as I mentioned, I've worked with other clients who absolutely use some of the sensitive information in their personalization. But it's interesting. At least one, actually two, of the clients that I worked for, one was similar to yours, healthcare specific. The other is insurance. Um, and in both cases, I think it's fair to say, and they made very, very clear that the goal of the company was the health of their customers. And if the goal of your organization is to improve the health outcomes of your customers, then wouldn't it make sense to send somebody with a history of, diabetes, or actually has diabetes, that wouldn't be a history, but, reminders to check their blood sugar? And wouldn't it make sense to, remind women to have their well woman checkup and things like that? And those things, to do that, you have to track that information and target and personalize, because obviously you wouldn't want to remind everybody to check their blood sugar. So I'm just curious, what kinds of personalization have you guys been able to do? What have you done with your data, and what are you not allowed to do, and why?
Sure. So I'll answer with where we're at today. It's a newer program for us, and we're certainly in the stages of, we're still developing that foundation. We're standing up different technology assets right now to enable personalization. So that's that's kind of the first hurdle, is we need to get these systems up and running and connected to each other in a way where we can leverage that information. So we're on our way there. The personalization we've been able to implement has been very light, and it's been primarily web behavior based at this point. And so it's very light, and kind of from my perspective in terms of personalization, it's probably considered, kind of that lighter targeting side. But I think that's a hurdle we need to get over first, and get to things like geo-targeting. And that's certainly been top of mind. I've heard many of my internal stakeholders talk about that. And so that was kind of touching on more of that education opportunity that I had mentioned earlier. So I think that's kind of the first answer, saying, okay, let's kind of answer this low-hanging fruit, get the geolocation aspects in place, and then see from a strategy standpoint how we can evolve and enhance our program to get more into the point where I love your example of the personalization score and the sensitivity score. I think that's something we can definitely look to do. We're just not there yet. But then also from an ethical perspective, as we were talking about the diabetes example, I think that's another point of interest for a lot of our marketing teams. They want to be able to reach consumers and serve up content to help them in their journey to improve their health outcomes. I think there's likely going to be some sensitivity again around how we look at people who are at risk for developing certain conditions. And that's going to be, I think, an area we'll have to tread very carefully. It's one thing when someone's been diagnosed with it and their expectation around the information that they probably inevitably know we're tracking to some degree is going to be very different when they're not diagnosed yet. And then there's certain risk stages. So I think that's an area that we'll have to continue to explore over time, and certainly leverage the medical expertise with folks within our organization to help us in that path.
Can I add something on the ethical side, Kelly, if I may? So it's interesting because I'm listening to Vanessa and I'm just thinking, actually, the opportunities that Vanessa will have whether theoretical or practical, with the data that you have to personalize. Essentially, if you think about it, you can actually save someone's life by personalizing their experience. And that's incredibly powerful. And if we put it like that, and we would go out to your customers and say, hey, this is what personalization could do for you, I suspect 99.9% will say, yes, I'm in. And so I think that what I'm trying to say, and I could give probably examples of that for Tony or for anyone else, saying, well, actually, you're someone coming to Tony saying, your personalization program has just saved me $500. Thank you very much. And for that, I'm willing to be personalized towards. So I think there's a conceptual understanding of how do we convey to customers that this is actually a good thing for them, and we're not just doing it for ourselves to improve our performances. It's actually something that they should be part of. And I think I talk from my own experience. I think we're failing on that at the time being, because there's much more fear out there of personalization than there is seeing the benefits from a customer point of view.
Maybe that's where something that Tony brought up earlier, can kind of, be contrasted. So rather than make personalization invisible and as invisible as possible to the end user, perhaps in certain industries, like healthcare, if you are upfront and obvious about the fact that you are personalizing it and are able to communicate that, this is why we're personalizing this, because, we have your health in mind, then you do want to be transparent about that, and, in healthcare, your doctor is personalizing your care, right? It's just that now that we have the digital experience and that we've got that universe of care expanded to include, digital and social and mobile, et cetera. I think that that boundary has to be made more explicit to the customer.
Almost like a opt-in instead of opt-out, and an explanation of why they might want to opt in, what they would benefit, how they would benefit.
Right.
But maybe that only makes sense. As Tony was saying, he has two different journeys. You've got the prospect and then the customer journey. Maybe that only makes sense with the member journey. Same for healthcare or health insurance or any sort of community where you have, these are just, prospects but then how would that apply in retail? What do you think about e-commerce?
I don't see, I think in the case of e-commerce, I can definitely see how you want to, there is an expectation of personalization that is already occurring in product recommendations and in things, again, coming back to the user preferences, but also, whether something is a gift or not, on a website. A lot of do-it-yourself kind of interfaces where, build your own, build your own sneaker, design your own bundle. Those kinds of things, are intensely personalized, and they're transparently so intensely personalized. But I think personalization, again, I think it comes back to the industry and the context. Even in media and entertainment, for example, you deal with large publishers that are subscription based, particularly like B2B. Like I'm thinking of like the Wolters Kluwer or the Thomson Reuters. There's the fact that I'm personalizing my own bundle, what journals or what tools I have access to is actually a selling point, and that's something you want to be very explicit that you're providing to the customer. So, yeah.
Some of the questions are popping up in the chat. I think there's an issue of trust, isn't there? Because we're so conditioned to companies telling us one thing and kind of masquerading or trying to conceive us. They're basically saying one thing and doing another thing. My favorite one is we're recording this a phone call for training purposes, and invariably it's probably not for training purposes. So how do we build that trust? That when we say to them, we want to opt you into personalization because it's for your own benefit. How do you create that trust? can Dignity Health, for example, put a message saying, by doing that, 50 of our members, their lives were saved? Is that going to be like, ooh, that I don't think your legal team is going to go for that, Vanessa? I don't know, but how do we create that trust? Is my question.
I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I agree with you that, I mean, making the statement that we saved X number of lives would be, I mean, ideally phenomenal to be able to attribute our efforts to that, but that's a very lofty statement that I think would have a lot of other.
Well, it doesn't need to be that. We've diagnosed early on, or we can improve diagnosis by 70% if you are willing to opt in. And then again, there's a trust question whether they believe that or not.
So I mean, it be as simple as we signed 50 new people to the exercise program that are in high risk for cardiac arrest program this year. I mean, and you can see what the impact is to insurance rates for the next year for those people. Long-running study, obviously.
You're cutting in and out pretty bad, Dylan, but I think you said it's as simple as being able to notify somebody that their pattern of behavior indicates that they may be at risk, or maybe some answers they gave you indicate that they may be at risk for, cardiac issues, and then being able to share that story with others. Is that what you're saying? Oh, and his phone dropped. Well, that's why he had audio issues. That's all right. Well, let's does anybody else have any questions or comments about the ethic? Oh, wait, is that you, Dylan? Nope. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions or comments about the ethical? Go ahead.
Well, I have one other thing. I mean, there's another aspect to ethical that I think has come up in like the last year, and we a lot of my clients that I work with, put a lot of effort into their search results pages, or their RSS feeds, again, sort of media and entertainment, and the personalizing it. I'm thinking of like the phenomenon of the siloed communities on social media, or the distribution of fake news, and that kind of stuff that's out there, right? Where you've because what someone's interest is, you are, the machines are going to throw at you more lookalike modeling, more stuff that's similar to what you've seen in the past, and that that's supposed to be a good thing, right? Because I mean, obviously, if I've looked at a lot of like Breitbart or Bannon stuff, then I'm going to want more, right? But
no. Maybe that's just me.
Well, but that that's the kind of phenomenon I think that it's
the echo chamber
from an exactly, from an ethical perspective. I think it's not something we think about that much because we're so focused on the legal, we're so focused on the privacy, we're so focused on the compliance that we also want to ask ourselves, and it is actually our responsibility as sort of the digital analytics community, where should we be drawing the line where we want to keep everything neutral, even if we do know so much about the customer.
Susan is sharing with me or actually she's shared it with everybody, the Affordable Health Care Act impact, which I haven't read about this. If anybody knows where we can get access to that, that might be an interesting way for anybody in the healthcare industry or insurance industry to be able to showcase how personalization can benefit them. And the story that she gave was that amputations were increased due to the affordable healthcare initially because people were getting the healthcare they needed for the first time, but then it dropped because they were also starting to get the reminders about their healthcare and they were getting preventative care. So knowing somebody's health situation and being able to remind them and being able to provide that preventative care has positive outcomes.
And I would say that's in line with what I think our teams are looking to do. Exactly. So no, it's definitely in line. I mean, where we can provide those preventive care resources, that's certainly something we want to be able to do. And it's just, there's that aspect of our information systems and being able to flag who those people are and then providing that content as well. Another thought I had around the attribution of being able to state, okay, we served up this personalized experience and this is the result that we got. Knowing this, I mean, diabetes is a well-known, issue with a lot of people, and knowing that other types of companies are interacting with them to provide that preventive care. So, for example, I used to work in vision insurance. So when someone had diabetic retinopathy, there are companies that are giving them reminders too. So just something that, we'll have to consider as we look to see how we measure our success. Those are other factors I think we'll just have to continue to consider when we're looking to do that.
Well, considering the time, let's pivot out of the ethical and deep thoughts part, and let's talk about some use cases. What have you guys seen that works? What have you seen that does not work? Because I think both of those are interesting. We learn from our failures as much as we do from our successes. So, anybody on the panel, or if anybody in the audience has questions or specific examples, throw them out.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to one that we're looking at implementing soon that I've seen be successful in the past, and it's sort of a step one as I see it from a personalization standpoint, and it's really focusing on two main components of traffic to your site, new versus returning. And it's providing one experience for new people, which is more brand specific, at least in our instance. We're trying to be more brand focused from a new visit perspective, and then anyone that returns, make it more about the intent of their visit. So for us, it's purchasing a phone and a plan, and sort of changing the experience in small ways, even if it's a single page that focuses in on that return visit, so that we can say, we know you've been here, we know you've seen content about our brand, so now let us get you to where you should be, and as fast as possible.
And I assume there'd be a third layer for the customers who come back to your site who are already members.
Yeah, so we are, since we sort of separate the prospect versus member, we actually just try to have two completely separate journeys that we're optimizing and personalizing. And initially, the way that I've always thought about personalization is in 3 stages. It's opt-in, where you allow them to choose a style. It's interactive, where depending upon what they click on and do, they can change things immediately for themselves. And then the third is sort of that behind the scenes personalization. So we would start with the behind the scenes and then allow them to sort of work their way backwards into personalization.
Who else?
Well, I tell you, we came to it often having challenges around being able to serve on the data we had. So we found that we kind of split personalization, and I prefer to use the term targeting, because I think personalization really means, to me at least, a one-to-one relationship, and for that you need the description that Paul gave us to begin this discussion. And we split personalization between persistent personalization and full personalization. And essentially, persistent personalization was more things, and this came about really from a technical standpoint, problem, challenge. The persistent personalization would be really targeting. Essentially, if you're coming from Thailand, you'll get a different experience than you would if you came from the UK. Whereas the full personalization would include a lot more of the information we would have about you, and then that would be split into the, as kind of Tony said, in the same vein, the new and returning, but more in terms of the anonymous, the known, and the identified. And then what we would do is, with identified, we would be able to pump in third-party data that really gave us demographical information about them. And of course, if they are a customer, then you also add to that the information we have about them. So, for example, I'm thinking of a big football club, a soccer club here in the UK that we work with, and they were able to pump the information of sales offline through a membership card. We can associate that with the specific visitor. So when they came to the site, we were able to target the specific either complementary or other products rather than pushing the main, replica shirt, kit shirt. Well, we actually know that you have that, so what's the point in pushing that one? Or we can tailor that to, oh, we know you like this specific player, we can tailor that. So I think that was how we approached that. But also bear in mind that we struggled with getting the data in real time, whether it was Adobe or another solution. And I'm not here to say who's better, who's worse, but we certainly had some challenges in terms of turning the analytics data into actionable insight, which I think Tony kind of talked about that as well.
Well, let's talk about that just a second. So you have the known, the unknown, the anonymous, the identified, which I think is we could break those, call them whatever we want, but that's pretty much so what everybody has. And with the identified ones, hopefully those are let's just call them the known, right? The known people you already have some sort of scoring or information. You have the data about them, and then you have the ability based on that information to target or retarget. What becomes difficult is delivering it real time, not just to that group of people, but also to the anonymous or the identified group using lookalike models or similar. Has anybody been able to successfully target in real time, personalize in real time? And what did that look like? How are you able to make it happen? Because that's a struggle that I've heard from not just you.
So I can actually speak to that. So not with my current company, since we are sort of getting into the stage one of personalization, but in previous engagements, the way that we did that was we created different ideas at different stages in the customer journey that would append onto a person that we could then send into a database and connect them to specific behaviors. And then that database was connected into all of our other technologies. So, leveraging the Adobe tools, since I've kind of spent a lot of time the last 6 years in the Adobe Marketing Cloud, we were passing data back and forth between some of them in real time with those ideas so that we could actually bucket people based on them either switching IDs, which meant they were going from stage to stage, or staying in an ID range and hitting them with different messages based on their actions once they left the site. So it could be product remarketing, it could be social media ads, or it could be emails if we knew who they were.
So in that scenario, it's really segmentation and personalization. It's not one-to-one.
Yes. Once they become known, it's much easier to do one-to-one because they don't sort of fluctuate in their behaviors. They sort of become known to the brand. Their behaviors kind of become consistent, and you know somewhat what they're expected to do, because usually as a member, there's sort of a finite amount of things you can do once you become a member. So it makes it a little bit easier to do that.
That makes sense.
And it doesn't mean that the segments are really broad. I mean, you can get down to the micro segment level, but I really like what really resonates with me is this idea of, stages in the customer journey. And you can do a lot of this in real time in a web analytics solution, connected to the rest of the Adobe cloud or the rest of, Google's, 360. But one concept that we've applied to in a number of client situations is the idea of a behavioral signature that ties directly to your customer lifecycle stage. So after doing a lot of analysis, you can identify, let's say, a dozen things that a visitor does or tends to do on a website that are typical for someone who is in the learn stage versus the ready to buy stage versus the returning customer kind of stage. And you can feed that directly into a Google Analytics or an Adobe Analytics in real time, so that later on in the site visit, or even as the page is loading, if there's like a secondary click or a flash or pop up or something, the AEM or the target instance is feeding on that new segment or new variable, and then giving you that personalized experience. And all of that can be done in an anonymous manner. I mean, you don't have to be a known customer to get that to trigger.
Yeah, but you don't have to be a known customer to get that to trigger, but to develop that behavioral model in the first place, that lookalike model, identify the behavioral signature, you have to take a small segment of group that you do know, and you have to potentially you could start with use cases and say, okay, we think that people that are here to sign up for a new plan, we think these are the things they'll do. And then we could go and look and identify people who did the thing we thought they wanted to do and say, okay, these people are this. But really, to be super accurate, it helps if your customers tell you, I'm here to do this. And then
I mean, I think voice of customer is a big, I think it's almost necessary if you're going to do robust segmentation exercise. And I agree, you have to know who they are. You don't have to know a lot of personal about them, but you have to be able to do the 360 stitching, so that I know what everyone has done over time.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I would love, everybody has given examples of stuff they've tried or that they're going to try. I would love to hear an example of something you've tried that didn't work. And just to get you started, I'll give you one that I did several years ago, back when, Windows was coming out with one of their new Windows things. And we were at Dell, and we decided that we were going to identify, and this is very much so targeting, but back then that was about as close as you get to personalization. We would identify what browser they were coming on, and if their browser indicated that they were, on an older browser, on an older computer, we would serve up the ad to upgrade to the new Windows system, and it flopped really, really badly. And it turned out that the reason it flopped is because the people who were on the older Internet Explorers and whatnot were also the people less likely to be interested in upgrades, because we only targeted it to people who were using very old browsers. And those are also the people who, it's little old people, elderly folks who are stuck in their ways and had no interest. So it wasn't a negative, it was just total flat. It had no impact at all. And so then when we combed through the data and we looked at who were these people and why were they not responding, we found out that we were targeting the wrong people with the message. So then we started looking, when we relaunched it, and we looked for everybody that had the newest available browser and operating system, but not the newest. And it had a huge lift because you're basically now targeting your early adopters. Totally different way of thinking about it. And it was just a problem of what we thought was true was not, our hypothesis was wrong. But do you guys have any examples of targeting or personalization gone wrong?
When people think, I'll just comment on that, Kelly, that was great success. I don't see that as a failure, is it?
You learned a lot. We learned a lot. Yes. Yeah.
So maybe 3 years ago, I was working with a company that decided to personalize based on email addresses. So whatever email engine you were using, they would create some sort of personalized experience on the site. The problem is that throughout the email confirmation process, they were not confirming emails the way that they should. So people were putting in like me@me.com, which was totally breaking it down. So if they had put in a fake email address and come back to the site, or an email that they didn't recognize as a main engine, not only did the page itself break, but the personalization would just pick a default. And it had just a really bad, created a bad experience, but also a bad brand experience that, the lesson learned basically was, prior to the personalization, understand your customer experience and journey. so that when you personalize, you know the potential impacts that it could have elsewhere.
Well, yeah, great point.
Can I
Yeah.
tail end on Tony's point? I think that most people also think of a personalization as they mix it with automation, and they seem to think or forget that it's not like launch and forget and it's going to increase revenue dramatically. In fact, if anything, personalization requires, at least what I've experienced, is you requires a lot more work, a lot more people involved, and it's so you don't get to the situation like what Tony's just described, where we kind of didn't we gave the system too many options or bad options, and it actually picked the wrong one. We need to be able to constantly monitor it before we launch, but also ongoing. And I think that that's a point, and it's not a failure, but it's certainly something that most organizations seem to forget.
Well, and the machine is like, have any of you ever seen the videos of the robots trying to fold laundry? They can't do it. You know, they may be able to file your taxes quite easily and do a lot of other stuff that we think is really difficult, but they cannot fold laundry. It's kind of like there's a level of art to personalization that requires a human brain to go in there and say, yes, that might work. If think about putting, machine learning on an ad where the machine is told that the goal is to get traffic to click on the ad. Okay, we've all seen those ads. We've seen them everywhere. They tend to be flashing and, have some nudity and other things, and it works, people click, but that's not what you want for your brand. So if you're not providing some human oversight to the tool, then yeah, you're going to have some problems. You need to tweak it. You need to make sure that that you're constantly tweaking who you're targeting. What is the ultimate goal? Who do you not want to see certain things? Because maybe a particular promotion is going to work really well for a particular segment, and maybe it would work great for a whole segment, but you don't really need to use it for this group of people who is these are your most loyal customers that are, money is not a problem and they're happily going to throw it your way. But if you give them a deal, yeah, they'll take it, but they would have bought it anyway. And a lot of times the tool is going to miss that. But you as the analyst can apply that level of understanding of your brand and your customers to the personalization efforts. We have 2 minutes. Any last thoughts that anybody would like to share about personalization? I'll start with you, Tony, and we'll go across. So Tony, Paul, Michael, Vanessa, in order. If there's any last thoughts or takeaways you want to share with the group.
Yeah, I think a good tip to understand is when you talk about personalization, people usually say you need a lot of content, which is true, but it doesn't always have to be new content. One of the best successes I've ever had is reusing content from the site and embedding it into other places that is just part of a different journey. It's a lot easier to do. It takes a lot less resources. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but reusing, for us specifically, reusing something about our plans as you get closer to purchasing a phone is an easy way to do personalization that drives all the information somebody needs to make a purchase decision.
I guess I'd go back to something we touched on a little earlier, sort of a parting tip that you can't really do personalization without a dialogue with the person you're trying to personalize, right? So I think that having a robust voice of customer, having some kind of a mechanism for a dialogue with the customer, if spills into like identity management, when in doubt, ask them, who's watching, you see this on Netflix, right? Anecdotally, we tried what Kelly was just describing as sort of like this kind of, pure machine learning, bottom up segmentation approach to travel data for a financial services, credit card company about 2 years ago. And we had, massive amounts of data about, where people were traveling, how many people were traveling, what kind of travel they did, where they went, when they went, how long they stayed. And we just could not get to some kind of a robust, simple, should we target business or family travel at this person, just because the data was too messy. So I would encourage, when thinking about personalization, go back and try to establish that dialogue.
Me?
You're up, Michael. Yep.
I don't know if I have tips. I'm just coming out of this thinking that in a few years' time we're going to have machines personalizing our lives, but the only thing we'll be doing is folding laundry. So at least
At least you got something.
At least we got something. Not sure how much that is. I sense, and I don't want to finish on a negative note, but I sense, and interestingly, at the DA Hub, Vanessa, coincidentally, ran a huddle on personalization. I felt that there, and slightly here as well, that there is a little bit disappointment with personalization. It seems like a great idea, but as opposed to the last panel we did, it just doesn't feel that there's like, hey, this is really great. And I think it's over across the board. Either we're not advanced to where we need to be in order for this to be very, very powerful, or that indeed it's I don't know, is it not really worthwhile personalizing? If that's the case, then I would say focus on targeting, because I seem to think of where we did target. It's certainly optimization, CRO on its own is not good enough. Targeting is go there, and don't necessarily, maybe don't use the word personalization. Maybe focus on doing targeting and move to advanced targeting, and that's the route. That's the solution.
Vanessa, close us out.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, Michael, for mentioning the huddle that we had at the DA Hub. So I'd say in combination with that session and this, it's been very validating to hear where people are at in their journey in personalization. Since we're at the point where we're building our program, we're at the very beginning. I'm happy to hear that. I've also gleaned so many great ideas from the conversation today. So I really appreciate everyone sharing. It's definitely helped shape how I'm going to be thinking about it and where we can hopefully start to execute and shape that program. So I'd say I don't really have any tips right now, but hopefully by the next DA Hub that we'll have some more experience and examples to share around that success, and maybe we'll rename it to targeting and advanced targeting, but this has been great.
Awesome. Thank you, panel. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it. As always, I will do my best to create a list of notes and send out the recording for those of you who missed elements of it or want to share with others. So thank you, everybody. Talk to you next time.